So today I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Simon Morgan, who is Head of History in the School of Cultural Studies and Humanities at Leeds Beckett University. So Simon's most recent books include A Victorian Woman's Place, Public Culture in the 19th Century, which examines women's public roles in Leeds and the West Riding before 1870. And he's also edited volumes 3 and 4 of the Letters of Richard Cobden. He's currently writing a book on personality and popular politics, 1815 to 1867, which focuses on the idea that even in the Victorian period, politicians were what we would now call celebrities. So this year sees the 160th anniversary of the opening of Leeds Town Hall, and to mark that occasion, Simon is giving his talk today on the topic of Civic Pride in Victorian Leeds, the Heaton family and their legacy. Please join me in welcoming Simon.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's great to be here in this fantastic building. In the same week 160 years ago, it was opened by Queen Victoria, and it has become associated for many people, particularly historians of urban Britain, with John Deakin Heaton, the Leeds doctor. I first discovered Heaton when I was researching my PhD, which eventually became the book of Victorian Woman's Place. So I wasn't necessarily hugely interested in Heaton himself, except for what he could tell me about the women in his life, particularly his sister Ellen Heaton, who's pictured up there as well, and his wife Fanny Heaton as well, who were both very much involved in various philanthropic and educational initiatives in Leeds in the 1850s, 60s, 70s and beyond. But more recently I've come back to Heaton and have been doing a bit of work around him and his contribution, which has recently been published in Urban History. It's currently available online. I think it's open access. Shane's not here, so I can't check with him. So you should be able to have a read of that, at least until it's officially published in the journal. But as part of that exercise, I had to sort of squeeze out the women a little bit because there was so much to say about Heaton himself in that article. So today I want to put the women back in. I want to talk again about Fanny and Ellen as well as John Deakin Heaton. Why is Heaton associated with the Town Hall? Well, in 1963, Asa Briggs, the great Victorian historian, published a very well-known book called Victorian Cities. And in Victorian Cities, there was a chapter on Leeds and civic pride. And that chapter focused around the building and opening of Leeds Town Hall as one of the greatest sort of expressions of mid-century civic pride. It was deliberately bigger than St George's Hall in Bradford and St George's Hall in Liverpool. It was very much a statement of Leeds' growing importance in the north of England. And Briggs identified that Heaton had been the chair of the Leeds Improvement Society, which had very much been pushing for the building of the Leeds Town Hall. And he also, according to his biographer, Thomas Weemsrey, delivered a very important lecture in January 1853, I think, where he talked about the importance of adding a clock tower to the original design. That without a clock tower, the Leeds Town Hall would not be aesthetically as striking as it is today. But also, because of that, it would no longer have the great intellectual and moral benefit that Heaton saw great architecture as possessing and as giving to the town and the city itself. So in 1853, there was a huge debate about this. The so-called Philistines on the Leeds City Council, the lower middle-class shopkeepers and tradesmen who were very intent on keeping the rates down, making sure they didn't have to pay too much, and the people who'd elected them didn't have to pay too much in rates, were dead against it. This was a useless appendage. What possible value could there be in a clock tower? So Heaton gave this lecture where he compared the town hall to the great civic buildings of the Low Countries in Ghent and Bruges with their tremendous clock towers that made them striking. And he felt that, without that, this would just become another sort of nondescript public building. There was a lesson too for the industrious poor. If you provide beautiful buildings, Heaton reasoned, they would raise their aspirations, they'd be inspired to lead virtuous and productive lives. And it would also show off the culture and taste of Leeds to those in other towns and cities. Now, ironically, Heaton's lecture may not actually have been as influential as both Briggs and his biographer Weems Reid assumed. In his journal, Heaton records that the lecture was thinly attended. And when I went to look up references to it in the local press, there's barely a mention. Dr. Heaton gave a lecture at the Philosophical Society on town halls, full stop, in both of the major newspapers, the Leeds Intelligencer and the Leeds Mercury. So, in some ways, the fact that this is currently Heaton's major claim to fame may actually be a little misplaced. There was a growing body of opinion in national journals like The Builder, for example, architectural journal, pushing for the clock tower to be included. So if anything, Heaton just added to this growing chorus of voices demanding the clock tower to be built. But this isn't to say that Heaton's contribution to the civic life of Leeds has been exaggerated. Far from it. I think there are huge swathes of the activities that Heaton did for the town, the causes he was involved with, the institutions that he helped to found and develop, that people are quite ignorant of and certainly aren't aware enough of. And that's where the family come in, because it wasn't just Heaton himself who was involved in these public-facing activities. In particular, his sister Ellen and his wife Fanny were very much involved in many philanthropic and educational activities. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, the Heaton family and their contribution. So who was John Deakin Heaton? He was born in 1817. He was the son of a Congregationalist bookseller, also called John Heaton, very confusing. In 1850, he married Fanny Heaton, the daughter of a guy called John Heaton, even more confusing. So Heaton's father, John Heaton, had owned one of the largest, if not the largest, book-selling printing businesses in the north of England. So he made a tidy sum for himself. He was able to buy a house for himself on Park Square. At that time, the kind of germ of what was going to be a kind of genteel Leeds West End, as described by Maurice Beresford in his book East End, West End, which was stymied by the smoke that then starts pouring across from Beanings and Gotts Mill there across that area. That's why the sort of Leeds middle classes start to migrate northwards in the early 19th century. He was able to pay for Heaton's education. He went to the Leeds Medical School and then to University College London after an abortive stint at Caius College, Cambridge, where he was very unhappy. And then Heaton returned as a fully fledged MD and began teaching duties at the Leeds Medical School himself. Although his father was a Congregationalist, Heaton himself was brought up as an Anglican. Before he went to the medical school, he'd been educated at Leeds Grammar School as well. And at various points, he was connected with most of the main medical institutions in Leeds. He served on the council of the medical school from 1844. He eventually became the senior physician at Leeds General Infirmary. He also worked for the dispensary and the House of Recovery, which I'll come on to in a moment. The reason we know so much about him is because he left this fabulous set. Doesn't just record his own public activities. He talks an awful lot about family life, family outings. Significant swathes of them are devoted to his continental tours. He was an early adopter of Cook's tours on the continent, so there are fantastic descriptions of travels through the German states, through France and elsewhere. They also talk, though, about the public activities of his wife and children and sister as well, which is why I first became interested in them, because they are a goldmine of information about that. His sons didn't really make a huge civic contribution during Heaton's own lifetime. In fact, he was very disappointed in his sons, particularly Arthur, who went to Cambridge. There was a hint of scandal around a possible affair with a maid in Cambridge, so Heaton has to decamp there rapidly to issue some fatherly advice and discipline before coming back to Leeds. He really felt that his sons wouldn't amount to much. In some ways, they were a kind of classic illustration of Martin Weiner's thesis on the gentrification of the middle classes in the 19th century. He had this idea that one of the reasons why Britain declined as a kind of trading mercantile nation was because so many of the innovators were sending their sons to public schools and to Cambridge and Oxford, and there they were becoming gentrified and far too interested in owning landed estates than running mills and factories. Well, Heaton wasn't a mill owner, but he was a provincial professional with a huge amount of involvement in the life of his native town, and he thought that his sons should do the same. And he couldn't understand why the sons that he sent to Charterhouse and Rugby and then to Cambridge weren't interested in coming back to Leeds. They were far too happy hobnobbing with the gentry at Cambridge to be interested in that. So the diaries do record an awful lot of the activities of the family as well as Heaton himself. A few years ago, with funding from the Centre for Culture and the Arts, I was able to put together a walking tour of Leeds based on the journals and the sites and institutions that are mentioned in them, which is still available, www.heatonmap.mobi, which links together 10 key sites in a nice sort of loop walking tour from the town centre and back again, but also dots in lots of other sites of interest too. So I would urge you, once you've finished listening to me today, I was going to say go and enjoy the Leeds sunshine. It's gone a little bit grey now, but this building is a point on the tour, so you could go up Great George Street and enjoy the rest of it if you so wish. Or you might just want to get some lunch. That's probably what I'd do. But anyway, do explore it when you get the time. So let's say a little bit more about the importance of family in Heaton's notions of civic interest. Heaton, the first thing he does, as with most sort of Victorian life writers in this period, he writes the kind of family tree of the different branches of the family. That's the journal open at the Deakin family tree, which traces back to, I think, the 15th century or something. So he's very sort of concerned with establishing this idea of lineage. And this comes across very much in the diaries, that he's very keen to celebrate not only his own contribution to civic life in Leeds, but also that of his father in particular. And after his father dies in the 1850s, an opportunity arises in the 1860s when the wonderful Leeds General Infirmary building is being built to actually have some kind of permanent memorial in there, because John Heaton Sr. was a member of the infirmary board. So Heaton pays for 2 windows to be put into the LGI chapel, which you can still see today. The first one dedicated to his father and mother, and the second one, less humbly, to himself and his wife, which is the one that is we can see on the screen now. And Fanny Heaton was a very big part of John Deacon Heaton's life. She had a keen interest in educational reform. She was a friend of Emily Davis, the founder of Girton College. She introduced Heaton to Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. Heaton was very startled to find that the first woman doctor in England, at Claremont one day, and being asked to take her around on a tour of the infirmary and the medical school, and ushering her quickly past the dissection room in case she saw anything unbecoming. for a woman's eyes. This woman's already a qualified doctor. She's seen it all before. So, you know, he is kind of in some ways being taken in new directions by his wife, who has some quite progressive views and contacts. Ellen Heaton, who I've mentioned earlier, was herself interested in various reforming causes. She was a corresponding member of the Kensington Society that collected signatures for the first women's suffrage petition in 1866. There's mention of her over in the Leeds Central Library in the Vote Before the Vote exhibition that opened last week in there, so I would urge you also to go and have a look at that. And she was also a great art collector. She was a correspondent of John Ruskin, who helped to guide her artistic tastes, and she was an early patron of Dante Gabriel Rossetti and other pre-Raphaelite painters. Her paintings, after her death, ended up in Tate Britain, and this is one of them by Arthur Hughes. That was a Piedmontese, which shows her interest actually in the case of the Italian Risorgimento, the movement to liberate Italy from Austrian interference and control, and the kind of unification process that goes on from 1860 onwards. And actually Ellen spent a lot of her time in Italy. She used to go out there most years, I think, and spent a portion of the year living in Italy. She had an independent income from property that her father left her. So she had artistic aspirations. She tried to cultivate literary celebrities. She was a member of the Browning Circle. There's some very catty letters from Elizabeth Barrett Browning where she slags off Ellen Heaton's provincial manners and accent. So I don't really know that she was entirely welcomed within that circle. Okay, so moving on, what I'd like to do is really sort of spend some time exploring some of the different areas in which Heaton's family contributed to the public life of this city. Starting, of course, oh, sorry, there's Fanny Heaton. I've missed out. I did Fanny first and then Ellen, rather the wrong way around. So there's a photograph of her. And Fanny was very much involved in setting up the Leeds Girls' High School, and there's its first premises on Woodhouse Lane, which later became a barracks in the early 20th century as the school moved up into Headingley. Right, so medicine first. Well, I mentioned Heaton's connection with the Leeds General Infirmary. At one point, he was holding the office of physician in the infirmary, the House of Recovery, and the Leeds Dispensary all at the same time. The House of Recovery was the fever hospital, set up in response to the various fever epidemics that Leeds suffered through the early 19th century. The dispensary was primarily for dealing with outpatients. At one point, Heaton was not only holding those three offices, he was the only physician working for the dispensary. In about 1853, he had to write a letter of resignation to the board before they actually acted and started appointing some more staff to take some of the weight off him. But he also was involved in the Leeds Women's and Children's Hospital. This is something that actually didn't come from the journals. It came from my kind of wider researches around Heaton that I discovered he held this role. He didn't mention it in the journal, but he was involved in the Leeds Women's and Children's Hospital, which is set up in about 1856-7, I think, possibly a bit earlier. And I've mentioned the Leeds School of Medicine already. So these are the involvements that you would expect from a doctor. These are the kind of things that are coming out of his professional side and identity. And it's that status, as well as his antecedents within the town, it's his status as a professional man that means that he is listened to by many of the opinion formers in Leeds and that he has influence. These are the sorts of roles that get him made a member of the Conversation Club, which was a very exclusive group of 12 leading citizens, self-identified leading citizens of Leeds, all men, of course. They included the main opinion formers, the editors of the Leeds Intelligencer, Christopher Kemplay, the editor of the Leeds Mercury, Edward Baines Jr. They also included various clergymen as well. So he was part of a very exclusive set. And part of his cachet came from the fact that he was an educated man and a very well-travelled man as well. His involvement in medicine also naturally went through into an involvement in education, not just through the medical school. When the Yorkshire Board of Education is set up, Heaton becomes the secretary to the Yorkshire Board of Education. It's the Yorkshire Board of Education that is the prime mover behind the creation of the Yorkshire College of Science, which very quickly becomes the Yorkshire College after English and history is added to the curriculum. It starts off as a technical college, teaching scientific techniques, very much closely allied to the local textile industry. But it becomes the Yorkshire College very quickly, which eventually, of course, becomes Leeds University. Heaton is the first chair of the Yorkshire College. He's instrumental in fighting against a plan to create a northern university based in Manchester on the Owens College. There's a great deal of sort of local rivalry comes into this. And eventually Owens College has to concede that it would be part of a federated northern institution called the Victoria University. I find it very ironic that Manchester University have recently kind of resurrected the title of Victoria University, which was only originally foisted on it by the jealousy of its northern rivals. So it's one of those great ironies of history, or small ironies of history, one should really say. But the Yorkshire Board of Education had a ladies' committee. And Ellen Heaton was active on the Ladies' Committee, which eventually establishes an independent existence as the Yorkshire Ladies' Council of Education. And they collaborated with the already existing Leeds Ladies Educational Association to found the Leeds Girls High School, which I previously mentioned. They were also involved in setting up the Yorkshire School of Cookery. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So Heaton had a finger in a lot of educational pies, as did his sister and his wife. Heaton himself was 4 times president of the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society. There were only 2 men who held that position for 4 years in this period. And he was also on the council of the Leeds Library. So he's very much involved in cultural institutions in the town as well. And in 1870, when under the new Education Act, passed, of course, under the influence of William Foster, the MP for Bradford, Heaton is elected to the first school board in Leeds from 1870 to 73, which gives him a very active role in provision of education for the poor as well as for the middle classes. Fanny Heaton manages to persuade John, after the creation of the Leeds Girls High School, to allow one of their daughters, Lucy, or Lou as she's known in the journals, to actually work as a salaried teacher at the school for 2 years. This is quite a radical step for a quite traditional middle-class man to take, to allow his daughter to work for a salary as a teacher in the school. And this is very much an experiment, as Heaton describes it in his diary. And after 2 years, he calls this experiment to a close, and he makes sure that Lucy resigns from this position. The reason that he gives is that he's had to withstand so much gossip from neighbours, peer pressure on this. But I think that the fact that he made the experiments in the first place is quite significant. It shows that although Heaton himself is enabling many of Fanny's public activities, and he's writing about them in the diary and supporting them, at the same time Fanny is pushing him in quite radical directions that otherwise he probably wouldn't have gone in. So I think that is very significant. And his daughters also start to become involved in some of these activities. Heaton's eldest daughter, Helen, briefly served on the committee of the Leeds Ladies Educational Association, as did her younger sister, May Rucker, who marries one of the professors at the Yorkshire College. Education leads on to involvement in other forms of social reform and philanthropy. In the Victorian period, philanthropy is seen as a natural outlet for women. Girls were encouraged to get involved from an early age. And Fanny Heaton was involved in a number of charitable causes. For example, the Mill Street Sewing School, which taught practical sewing skills to factory girls. She was involved in the Leeds Invalid Soup Kitchen in the 1860s. And when that institution was attacked by the press for encouraging indigence, much in the same way that certain newspapers attack food banks and things like that, in the modern day, she wrote a very spirited letter in its defence to the newspapers. And she also got involved in the Leeds Cotton Famine Relief Association, the Ladies Cotton Famine Relief Association, which actually predated the Men's Cotton Famine Relief Committee in Leeds and had an independent existence from it. And again, this is an instance of where Heaton is not only an enabler of Fanny's activities, but also becomes involved in them himself on some level. Because when the treasurer to the Ladies Cotton Famine Relief Association falls ill, Heaton steps into the breach, and he does so in a very private way. It's not publicised that he's taken over the role of treasurer to look after the accounts. This was something he was very good at. He was always being made treasurer of various things. People trusted him with money. You can see that. And when the original treasurer recovers, Heaton then sort of steps back. And we only know about this because it's mentioned in the journals. So, cotton famine relief, other philanthropic work that the Heatons are involved with. Helen Heaton organises a charity concert in support of the Leeds Blind Asylum, for example. And Fanny Heaton is involved in teaching at some of the schools attached to some of the Anglican churches in Leeds, St Stephen's and St George's schools. The Yorkshire Ladies Council of Education, which I've already mentioned, helps to set up the Yorkshire School of Cookery. This is aimed, it has two aims. One is to teach middle-class girls how to cook. So it's a kind of cookery school for the semi-posh, I suppose, in that sense. But it's also involved with teaching working-class women how to cook, women and girls how to cook as well. So it has this kind of social mission too. And that ties in with the work of the Sanitary Committee of the Yorkshire Ladies Council of Education, which involved Ellen Heaton, Heaton's sister. The Sanitary Committee was all about teaching working class women how to look after themselves and their families and their houses, keeping everything clean, keeping children healthy, and so on and so forth. And Ellen uses this as a sort of platform to develop something of a public voice. She eventually gives a paper to the National Association for the Promotion of Social Science on her sanitary work in Leeds, which is the first sort of national organisation that allows women to actually stand up on a platform and deliver a lecture. So that's a very kind of important enabler of women, that organisation. Social reform, yeah. Social reform brings us now on to religion. This is an aspect of Heaton's life which has perhaps been relatively underexplored, and it's one of the things that I wished I'd had more space to talk about in the article I've just published, because I think that Heaton's identity as an Anglican is very important to him. The fact that he is the descendant of a leading Congregationalist, who was one of the kind of founding fathers of Queen Street Chapel when the congregation moved into those premises, gives him a toehold in the nonconformist community in Leeds, the dissenters. It allows him to put himself forward as an honest broker in many kind of cultural organisations and civic initiatives between the Anglican and dissenting communities. If any of you have read Bob Morris's book, Class, Sect and Party, you will know that Leeds was riven by divisions between nonconformists and Anglicans in the 19th century. So there were very few fora in which they could gather to discuss ideas and matters of common concern. And Morris argues that the Philosophical and Literary Society that Heaton was president of for 4 years was a key institution in bringing those groups together. So he's seen as a sort of honest broker, but he's also a very staunch Anglican. And we can see that this really mattered to him. When his father died, Heaton became a shareholder in the Leeds Cemetery Company, which basically had constructed St George's Fields Cemetery, which is now part of the University of Leeds. Fantastic place if you've never been there and had a wander around. When he took over the shareholding in this institution, this was something that had been created basically to fill the gap once the Leeds churchyards started to become full, before the introduction of municipal cemeteries. And it was basically a profit-making kind of organisation. It also was, of course, not consecrated ground by the Anglican Church. So when after Heaton becomes a shareholder in this, he decides that he wants to remove his mother's body from this cemetery and have it reinterred at St George's Churchyard, which was the church where Heaton himself worshipped. So he paid for this to happen. But his Anglican qualms didn't extend far enough to actually divesting himself of the shareholding, as far as I know. So he's still content to make money out of this. So there's an element of self-interest mixed in. So Heaton his Anglican identity is very important. He's a trustee of St George's Church. He's a trustee of St Andrew's Church, a Gilbert Scott church, which we no longer have. It was demolished. And also a trustee of St Michael's, Buslingthorpe. He was heavily involved in the Church Extension Society. Those of you who know Leeds history well will have heard of Dean Hook, Walter Farquhar Hook, who is credited with leading the Anglican revival in Leeds. He arrives in Leeds in, I think, 1837, and writes to his bishop and says that Methodism is the established religion in Leeds. We need to do something about these Methodists. So he starts a campaign to raise money, to get grants, to extend the amount of church provision in Leeds. And this becomes critical after the 1851 census, religious census, that reveals how few people, not only how few sittings there are in Leeds for the Anglican community, but also how few people are attending. So church extension becomes a huge thing. Hook leaves in 1859. He goes off to Chichester to become Dean of Chichester Cathedral. But his work is continued, and Heaton is one of the key figures in continuing that work of expanding the provision of churches in Leeds. And Emmanuel Church is one of which is now the chaplaincy for the University of Leeds, is one of the institutions that comes out of that. So Heaton's Anglicanism also leads him to become much more of a political animal towards the end of his life. Most elections, Heaton didn't even vote. He was, as a doctor and as this honest broker between the dissenters and the Anglicans, he didn't want to get involved in partisan politics, which were heavily tied in with religious identities in the middle of the 19th century. What tips the balance for him, though, is the creation of the Leeds School Board in 1870. And this is an illustration of the way that Heaton liked to operate, because he liked to be an influencer behind the scenes. He didn't like putting himself forward for things like elections to municipal councils. He never did that. He wanted to exercise influence rather than exercise power in that sense. But he was also very much part of a kind of very patrician mindset that felt that the middle classes, particularly the educated middle classes, should be the social and cultural leaders of the town. So when the education bill goes through, he does what comes naturally to him. He thinks, what we need is to make sure that the people who are chosen to become the Leeds School Board, the first Leeds School Board, should be chosen by the most intelligent members of the community. So he draws up a list of 50, or he helps somebody else to draw up a list of the 50 most intelligent leading men, of course, of the community to select this new body. And then the press get wind of it. There is a sort of public meeting and there's a huge outcry against this, and they are forced to go to an open election. And once it goes to an open election, Heaton realises that he hasn't got a cat in hell's chance of getting elected to this board as an independent person. He doesn't, unlike some of the other people on the list, own a huge mill where he can get all his mill hands to vote for him if they have a vote in the school board election. So he joins the Anglican ticket and he is elected. And he's very proud of himself. He's proud to have been elected, despite the fact that he has no sort of individual constituency to back him up. After he leaves the school board in 1873, he actually does become more actively involved in politics. He becomes involved in one of the county elections as a committee member for the Conservatives electoral candidate, on the basis that he feels the Liberals are going to threaten the Anglican interest in the school board. So he becomes very much aware that, or very much keen to defend what he sees as the Anglican Church's position in education in Leeds this way. Okay, so that's just four different overlapping areas that Heaton was involved in. I decided to finish by noting a few things. One is that Heaton, for a man who gave so much of his life to the city of Leeds and to this kind of idea of public duty that he had, he didn't always think that he'd done the right thing. Every year in his journals, much in the same way as the Gladstone diaries, he has this kind of resume of the year at the end of the year and how he thinks his life is going at that point. And through the 1870s, they become very pessimistic. He feels that he's wasted his life. He feels that he has unrealised ambitions, that his aim to create a lucrative private practice to provide for himself and his family has played second fiddle to all of this public engagement. And even when good things happen to him, there's always a kind of sort of slightly pessimistic sting in the tail. When he's made, for example, a Justice of the Peace for the West Riding in 1871, he says, "This is a distinction of which I have been for some time ambitious, and the acquisition of which gave me more satisfaction than any circumstance which has occurred to me for some time. And feeling at the time much dispirited and disappointed, I found much gratification and encouragement in the appointment. I felt also that it was not undeserved, in return for much public self-denying work of various kinds in which I have been concerned for many years." However, I don't think we can agree with Heaton's account of himself. We can agree more with his biographer Thomas Weems Reed that Heaton was, quote, "one of a class of men who are too little known to the world at large, whose work is too often ignored, and whose great, though unobtrusive influence on our social life is felt but not acknowledged." And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about Heaton and particularly about his family as well today, so that we can just acknowledge a little bit some of that contribution that they made. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Simon. That's really fascinating. Do we have any questions? I have one, but anyone else before me? Yes, Heather.
Simon, I know these things aren't mutually exclusive, but how much is he motivated by philanthropy? And, whether that's humanitarianism or charity or whatever, and how much, is there social climbing there? How much is he just motivated by that sort of desire for status and to just rise and rise and rise? Because he takes so much on, is it genuinely about philanthropy, or does he really want to be the sort of businessman?
I think there is a sense of duty there. I mean, this is what I'm trying to unpack in the article, is exactly where where this activity comes from, where this desire to serve the town comes from. And I think there is a sense of duty. I think there's a sense of duty to his family name, and his antecedents. He's very keen to uphold his father's status in the community and enhance it if possible. But there is also a sort of sense that this becomes a kind of self-fulfilling thing, that he can't say no to stuff. I mean, he has so many different roles. One of the things that I sort of haven't got to hand, there's an obituary. Well, actually, no, there's the funeral oration that's given by Dr. Gott, who's the parish priest when in Leeds parish when Heaton dies, lists all of the different things that he was doing in the town at the point of his death, and there's just so many things that he's involved in. No wonder his private practice suffered, because there's so much to do. I went through the school board records, and he's always been called away from meetings early to go to attend either other meetings somewhere else, or because there's a patient that he needs to see, and things like that. He's a very diligent attender, but he's also one of the most likely people not to get to the end of the meeting. So he has a lot going on in that sense. So I think that although, there's definitely that social aspect to it, there is this notion of maintaining the family status, maintaining his status in the community. And he's really very kind of almost childishly pleased when he gets these baubles, like becoming a JP, or when he's made a member of the Pious Uses Trust, for instance, which I kind of skirted over a little bit on the presentation. But at the same time, there is this sort of sense that he has to keep doing it. Once he's started and committed to things, his own sort of sense of duty won't let him step aside or let somebody else do it. So. Stress. I can't remember off the top of my head now what he actually dies of. I think it's a quite sudden illness. Yeah.
It's not a question, but just to add to that, could it be because he was a man of faith, he's carrying out his duty as a servant, which is the whole ethos of Christianity, to be a servant to the community.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's why I wanted to sort of bring in the Anglicanism at the end, because I think this is something that probably hasn't been thought about enough in relation to ideas about civic pride and the individual motivation in this period. I mean, obviously it is at kind of earlier periods when you're thinking about the medieval world or the early modern world. But I think that, there is this sort of, that sense of duty does come from that to a degree. But I think it is mixed in with these other things, including filial piety as well.
What did you make of the influx of both economic and family migrants from Ireland to Leeds in the 1850s as an assault both on Anglicanism and also on the social order and disruption to civic life?
I don't think there's a huge amount, actually, on that. I mean, obviously there's an awful lot of discussion and debate generally around sort of, particularly around the kind of sanitary reform debates in the 1840s, which focuses often around the Irish districts in places like Manchester and Liverpool, because the Irish are seen to live in the worst accommodation, and particularly the kind of habit that is brought over from the rural districts of Ireland, keeping pigs in the house and things like that. And, they have to pass bylaws against it in Manchester and things like that. So I think that is part of the debate. He's not actually that interested in sanitary reform. He's actually much more interested in smoke pollution. Where's Steve? Smoke pollution is the thing that really bothers him. And again, you can see an element of self-interest in that, because he lives, his first house in Leeds, when he moves out of the family home, is on South Parade. And again, you're suffering from the kind of smoke pollution that's coming across from Beanings. They move up to Claremont, which is in Little Woodhouse, but they can still see the smoke from the factories there, even if they're not necessarily getting bothered by it so much up there. So he's actually one of the kind of leading movers in the early smoke prevention movement, which is based around the Leeds Improvement Society. So he's more interested in that than he is in sanitary reform and the kind of social conditions of the kind of working classes in Leeds in that sense. He does a little bit on his own account. He owns property all over Leeds, and he does talk at one point about demolishing some houses in Hunslet so that he can rebuild them in a better condition for the working class artisans who lived there, which he said isn't going to make me any money, but it's something that I feel I ought to do. But yeah, he's quite quiet about the Anglicans and the Catholics and the Irish migrants.
Can I just ask about his daughter who had to give up her job after 2 years? Is there any record of her, did she just go along with this? Was there any, debate? Does he record that in his...
I think he records that she was upset. Yeah, but she has to go along with it. She's forced to. I mean, the reasons he gives are interesting. It's the gossip is one of the things. Yeah. I mean, he's mortified one night when he attends a lecture by Lady Elektra, and she makes reference to the fact that his daughter's working there. Not directly, but she refers to her working here, and he's kind of totally embarrassed by this. But yeah, clearly that there are there's words being exchanged behind closed doors by the neighbours as well. So that's the main reason. But he also gives us the reason that he thinks that a woman of her station shouldn't be having to work her fingers to the bone for the pittance that she gets as a teacher. Basically, she should be enjoying a sort of more genteel life of leisure and enjoying the society of her peers rather than teaching.
I think that's really interesting in terms of the cliche that women's roles are only in the private sphere in the Victorian period, and your work shows the extent to which that's not true in one way, but also the lip service that was at least paid to that idea, even if people did have quite a huge municipal role, as his one sister obviously did. It had to be within certain terms that was
That's true, but as I say, the interesting thing is the extent to which he enables his family to do things outside the home, and Fanny Heaton is an invalid for a lot of the 1860s and early 1870s, and he actually sort of gauges how well she's feeling by how many public meetings she's able to attend and things like that. So actually, her ability to get out of the house and involve herself in public activities becomes important there. And that's why I was keen to bring in the extent to which he's not just enabling them, but also they're pushing him into, because they're clearly more progressive than he is. I mean, they're supporting things like higher education for women. They're helping. I think we don't know for certain whether Ellen Heaton collected votes for the 1866 petition. Signatures. But it's likely that she did. She was the corresponding member of the Kensington Society in Leeds. Fanny Heaton signed that petition. She may well also have assisted in gathering signatures too. So, they are quite progressive, and he's quite a sort of traditional patrician conservative with a small c and eventually with a large one, pater familias, and they are pushing him in new directions, I think, in quite interesting ways.
Anyone else? Yes.
Did Ellen's work as a women's rights activist sort of attract disapproval too, or? Ellen
generally attracted disapproval. He really didn't. The wayward sister. She was independent. She was financially independent. She was quite intellectually independent and willful, as Heaton would have seen it. She was quite notorious at the Leeds Library. She used to sit on all the newspapers when they arrived and release them one by one as she'd finished reading them so that the other members could get them. And this actually causes the Leeds Library to pass a rule that members may only consult one newspaper at a time. She's the first woman to stand for election to the committee of the Leeds Library. She doesn't succeed because she's made herself quite unpopular by this point, one surmises. So she's interesting. Heaton disapproves of her celebrity hunting as well. They go to one of the Paris expositions in the 1860s, and basically she spies Louis Napoleon and his entourage arriving at this exposition, and then leads them on a sort of dance around the whole place trying to catch up with them so she can meet the great man. So Heaton finds this excruciatingly embarrassing because he is quite a private man in many ways, which is why he doesn't like putting himself up for elections. So he doesn't approve of her in all respects, but he is very supportive of her. When her work for the Sanitary Commission was criticised publicly, Heaton actually stood up, because the two organisations were linked through the Yorkshire Board of Education and the ladies' committee of that and so on. Heaton actually stood up and defended the work of the sanitary committee, which his sister was the chair of, because it was valuable. And he said, it's no good, this is when he harks back to these buildings that he's made. He says, it's no good me making nice buildings for artisans to live in if they just move in and turn it into a pigsty. You need to have them educated so that they know how to look after it properly, and this is what this committee is doing. So yeah, he is very supportive in public of her.
Well, I think these Victorians have put us all to shame, really, how much they get done. Thank you very much, Simon. If anyone would like to ask Simon anything else, please